Game companies don't just become massive successes overnight. For every Madden 26, there's a one-on-one Julius Erving and Larry Bird. For every Call of Duty Black Ops 6, there's a Kaboom. For every GTA 6, there's a Menace, and admittedly that one is so obscure I had to look it up. The whole point is most developers and publishers have to start somewhere, and usually they try a bunch of things before they get to where they can just release a game and have it be a massive hit. I mean, I guess unless you're Notch and Mojang and create a game that goes viral on 4chan of all places. Don't ask me why I know that. One of the most famous development firms around today is Blizzard, who has done so well for themselves since their early days that they not only merged with industry titan Activision, yes, the same Activision of Kaboom fame, they also managed to get themselves bought by Microsoft for $69 billion. Now, don't get me wrong, Kaboom is a great game, although it does lose something without the paddle controllers. But, I don't know that it's worth $69 billion to have it available in your digital store. I mean, I certainly wouldn't go higher than $65 billion. 69 is just excessive. In all seriousness, of course, Microsoft wasn't paying all that money for old Atari 2600 games. On the Activision side of the house, it was going towards Call of Duty. But they were also paying money for some very valuable assets from Blizzard, specifically the Warcraft and Diablo IPs, which over the last 30 years have turned into ridiculously successful franchises despite a relative lack of actual games. But there was a time when Blizzard was still figuring out who they were, so to speak, and releasing games that didn't have Craft or Diablo anywhere in their names. You've definitely heard me talk about my all-time favorite racing game in Rock and Roll Racing if you've been around the channel for any length of time. And you've probably also heard of The Lost Vikings, either the original or its sequel. But Blizzard also tried their hand at the action arena, coming up with another wholly original IP that you may have missed. However, I should probably pause for a second because, I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now confused because, I've been talking about Blizzard IP, but I haven't mentioned one of their most successful ones, StarCraft. Well, I'm sorry, but I still haven't forgiven them for canceling StarCraft Ghost. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega, or Mega CD as the case may be, and as we are today, the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Anyway, the game that I'm referring to and reviewing today is Blackthorne for the 32X. Blackthorne actually started out life on the Super Nintendo, just like Rock and Roll Racing and The Lost Vikings before it, but this time around, rather than the game getting a port to the Genesis, Sega worked with Blizzard and Paradox Development to port it to the more powerful 32X in October of 1995 instead. So was the upgrade worth it? Is this possibly one of the hidden gems of the 32X? Or is there a very good reason why there was never a Blackthorne 2 and the game was all but forgotten over the last 30 years? Well, we'll get into all that, but first, a look at this very nice condition package.
And here's my copy of Blackthorne for the 32X. And right off the bat, let's discuss the elephant in the room here, that price tag up at the top. This copy is one that I purchased with a few other 32X games last year in a Black Friday sale at Retro Dimension. And if you're not familiar with Retro Dimension, they are the best retro game store in the Chicago area, bar none. And I'm not getting paid to say that, it's just simply the truth. And I highly encourage anyone that's into retro games and nearby the Chicagoland area to check them out. And as a bonus, since I bought this, they've opened up a second location, and they're both equally great. So whichever one you stop in, you'll probably find something that you like. Anyway, back to Blackthorne. Due to said Black Friday sale, no, I did not pay $399.99 for this copy, but it was also not cheap. These days, if you can find a copy, you probably will be paying around $400 for it complete, but Price Charting has it going anywhere from $250 to $450 right now, all depending on condition. Speaking of condition, the price tag says mint here with an exclamation point, and while that's a slight overstatement, it's still a very, very nice copy, with only the most minor marks, mainly on the inner tray, which are almost impossible to avoid if you're actually going to play the game. It's certainly nicer than any copy I could find on eBay currently, minus 2 slabbed sealed copies, and I'm grateful to have it in the collection. As far as the front cover goes, it's great, chiefly because of the beautiful Jim Lee artwork. If you're not familiar with comic books and don't know who Jim Lee is, well, he's not quite as big a deal as that other Lee, Rip Stan, but honestly, he's not too far off, seeing as how he's now the president, publisher, and chief creative officer of DC Comics. Back in 1995, though, he was merely just one of the hottest comic book artists on the planet, coming off of his work on X-Men in the early 90s and being one of the original 6 artists to form Image Comics. So Interplay getting his art for the cover and advertisements was a huge deal. Unfortunately, I've got to say this is not the best version of the cover. That goes to the Super Nintendo version with the original unedited art, which was then cut up and moved around to fit in the 32X layout. I really would have liked to have seen them pull a Minnesota Fats here and flip the art on its side, so it wouldn't have had to be edited, but, c'est la vie. Flipping over the back, and, I've got to be honest, I'm not super impressed. First off, the screenshots aren't nearly as good as I would expect, especially this one on the left that looks like they yanked the contrast all the way up before they took the picture. And then there's this text at the top. The conqueror Sarlacc opposes his vicious troops against the enraged prince. Opposes his vicious troops? I mean, yes, technically you can use the word oppose in that manner, but maybe save the Shakespeare for the stage and not the hype text on the game design for teenagers. Inside the box, the manual and cartridge are just as nice as the outside of the package. The manual is sharp, and I really like them going with the very stylized dark pages. It's a nice switch up from the normal black on white Xerox pages. The manual opens with the game's backstory, and it's a doozy with 4.5 pages just as an intro. But considering this is from Blizzard, 4.5 pages is actually kind of light when it comes to lore. The rest of the manual is solid and has a nice tutorial section that teaches you how to play the game, so that's nice. I think my only issue is the same problem that a lot of these black and white manuals have, and it's that even though they clearly went through some effort with the screenshots to illustrate characters and items, in some of these pictures it's just impossible to see what they're trying to show. Okay, that's the package. Let's fight those vicious opposing troops of Sarlacc. See how easy that was, copy editor? Before getting into the review, there's a few region notes to cover here. While the 32X version was only released in North America and Brazil, the other versions of the game, i.e. the Super Nintendo and PC-DOS versions, made their way to Europe. And because of that, I want to clarify something that might be confusing to Europeans, and that's that, yes, this is the same game that you might know as Blackhawk rather than Blackthorne. Why was it renamed Blackhawk in Europe? I couldn't possibly tell you, but I'm going to assume it's due to some sort of bizarre rights issue in that region that must have been solved by the time the Game Boy Advance version was released in 2003. Okay, now that that clarification's out of the way, regardless of whether you call it Blackthorne or Blackhawk, what is it? Well, even though I joked about the lengthy backstory in the manual earlier, I do appreciate the attempt at world building, as convoluted as it is. The short version is that there's a world called Tool that long ago lived in peace and harmony, but at some point, the leader of the world was turned into two stones, a light stone and a dark stone. Part of the population revered the light stone, and they continued to live in peace, but then the other half of the population followed the dark stone, and, surprise, surprise, slowly turned into evil monsters. Eventually, the Kadrasul, i.e. the bad guys, decided to attack the Androthi, i.e. the good guys, led by Chief Bad Guy Sarlacc. I guess the guys at Blizzard really liked Return of the Jedi. You play as Kyle Blackthorne, who was the prince of the Androthi when Sarlacc chose to attack, so your dad, the king, decided to dump you on Earth for 20 years, giving you the chance to turn into some sort of drifter badass, before getting teleported back to Tool to try to defeat Sarlacc and save the world, while returning to your rightful place as king. There, I just saved you 4.5 pages of reading. I joke about the backstory, but honestly, I really appreciate how creative and original Blizzard attempted to be when creating the story here. I've certainly played plenty of games on the channel previously that either were things that you've seen a million times or just didn't make any sense, and Blackthorne does a good job of riding the line between those two. So how does Kyle go about his crusade against Sarlacc and to free Tull? Well, if you're looking for a genre description, it would probably be a side-scrolling action platformer, but don't expect Gunstar heroes here. Don't get me wrong, Blackthorne does feature plenty of action, as you'll spend a good portion of the game either in shootouts or blowing things up with various special weapons, but if you're looking for a fast-paced action-adventure, this isn't that. I've seen other people compare Blackthorne to Flashback, but sadly, when I get around to playing Flashback for the channel, it will be my first experience actually playing that game, so I can't make the comparison myself. And feel free to make fun of me down in the comments below for that. What I can compare Blackthorne to is two games that I have played, Impossible Mission and Super Metroid. Like Impossible Mission, the bulk of Blackthorne is made up of single-screen rooms that tend to have 3 vertical levels, with the rooms more or less acting independent of one another. There is the occasional crossover. For instance, it's not uncommon for enemies that walk on connecting sections of the levels to move between the rooms, which can change how you approach attempting to clear them out, but most of the time each room is its own puzzle to solve. I'll discuss more about the Impossible Mission connection when I get to the controls later, as it's not just isolated to the level layouts. The Super Metroid connection comes in a few ways, the first of which is not just with how the levels are constructed and the rooms are physically connected, but also in how the levels progress. To make your way through a level, you're going to need items. These come in 2 different types, weapons and non-weapons. Non-weapons include things like door keys, bridge keys, and a levitator that allows you to reach higher platforms than you normally could get to on your own. Then there's the weapons, which consist of 3 different types of bombs. The most useful of those is a remote control bomb, which you'll frequently need to blow up some sort of control panel that you physically can't get to yourself, but sometimes you'll just need a regular old bomb for blowing up a door. Imagine this. In a level, you might be in a situation where you need to get through a gate which is only openable by a key. But to get the key, you have to get it from an enemy that's up on a platform that you normally can't reach due to it being too high up in the air. So instead, you have to get the levitator by finding one of the Androthi slaves. But once you get the levitator, you still can't use it because you'd have to place it on a bridge that you haven't found the key for yet, so you have to go and kill another enemy that drops the bridge key, but before you can do that, you have to kill another enemy to get the remote bombs to blow up the control panel to get through the door to get to that last enemy. I'm sure that sounds very convoluted, and it is somewhat, but it's really just that standard Metroidvania styling of where you can't just go straight through a level, requiring you to really explore and search every area of a level to be successful. And to even further illustrate this point, when Blizzard released their Blizzard Arcade collection for modern consoles and included a definitive version of Blackthorne, it also included a map utility, allowing you to keep up with where you were at in the level. Now, what other game or games does that sound like? Unfortunately, as much as I enjoyed this almost puzzle action style of gameplay that was employed with Blackthorne, the actual gameplay, i.e. what happens when you hit the buttons, I feel like could have used some more polish. This is where I think some people get the flashback connotations. The gameplay in Blackthorne is very stiff, with all of Kyle's movements being incredibly deliberate. This is what I meant when I stated that it's not a fast-paced action title. You are frequently moving Kyle to very specific portions of the screen, and Kyle doesn't have inertia. If you're moving in a direction and you pull off the D-pad, Kyle stops moving. For the most part, I don't mind it, and combined with the needing to duck in and out of cover when you get into gunfights with enemies, the slow pace turns the game into more of a thinking man's action game, which goes well with the previously discussed Metroidvania style of gameplay. However, there is one place specifically where this style of gameplay fails a bit, and that's on the occasion that you have to make a running jump. The way running jumps are supposed to work is you hit the C button while pressing right or left to start running in that direction, and then you hit the B button while running to try to make your leap to wherever you're trying to reach. In theory, running jumps of course have been a thing since at least the first Super Mario Bros., so the concept is sound. But the problem is, the way that they're implemented in the game, with the stiffness of the controls, means that your timing has to be impeccable to pull off the leaps as desired. And even with lots of practice, something that I can certainly attest to, you're going to miss jumps. If this was just a situation where, oh well, go back up on the platform and try again, it wouldn't be that big a deal. But frequently, missing one of these leaps means that you're either falling to your doom, or you're not going to get to a door on time before it closes. This is that other place where I got some of the impossible mission feeling from, and if you've played that game, you know exactly what I mean about not quite timing a leap correctly and falling to your doom. Although, in Impossible Mission, missing a jump like that usually just means you lose time, rather than having to restart completely. One other thing to mention as far as how the game is constructed is how save games work. Blackthorne uses password saves for every level in the game, and I think that's how it should be if you're going to have a game like this. Each level, if you're playing carefully, is going to take about 20 to 30 minutes to complete, so having passwords for a set of levels rather than each individual level would be too much. And thankfully, the game uses one of the easiest password systems in existence, with each level only having a 4-character password. Something that's a bit of a miracle to see after having to deal with Super Monaco GP's monstrous passwords a few months ago. There's just one problem. The extra simple password system means that there's no carrying over of items from level to level. And even if you're not continuing, when you start a new level, you'll give up any items that you may have carried over from the previous level. Now, this isn't a huge deal as you have a limited inventory anyway, and you'll always be able to find whatever items you need to complete a level in a level, but I could definitely see some people complaining that they can't bring over things like extra healing potions with them. And it does seem a little weird that Kyle just happens to empty his pockets anytime he gets in an elevator. Before I get into the graphics and sound, there is one last thing to discuss about Blackthorne, and that's what it actually is. If you're like me, you probably thought for the last 30 years that Blackthorne on the 32X was just a port of the Super Nintendo game, but possibly with more colorful graphics due to the 32X's expanded palette. And, it is, sort of. Of note here is that the 32X version of Blackthorne wasn't actually handled by Blizzard itself. It was done by Paradox Development. And Paradox wasn't happy with just bringing across Blackthorne as is. Oh no, they completely redid all the visuals using CGI rendering versus the hand-drawn style that was used in the Super Nintendo version. But Paradox wasn't done there, as they also added an entire new area to the game. The original version of the game consists of 16 levels, 17 if you count the boss fight, with the first 16 split into 4 areas. Paradox added a new 4-level snow area as the second area of the game, now giving players 20% more Blackthorne. I could see some people preferring the original version of Blackthorne with the hand-drawn artwork, but honestly, I think the rendered artwork is great too, with equally as smooth animation, and the extra 4 levels is simply a huge upgrade, especially at a time when things like DLC didn't exist for console games. Speaking of the graphics in Blackthorne, I think they're fantastic, and in my mind, they're exactly what the power of the 32X was always designed for. Previously, the 32X games that I've covered on the channel haven't exactly wowed me, with probably the best of the bunch being a version of Virtua Fighter that was arguably better than the rushed original Saturn version, but none of the 32X games so far have really brought home the promise of true 32-bit action on the Genesis. Blackthorne changes all that, with colorful graphics that aren't afraid to use the 32X's 32,000 on-screen colors, nice weather effects for snow and rain, fluid animation for both Kyle and all the enemies, and layered levels with multiple backgrounds and foregrounds. I remember specifically seeing the background for the forest level for the first time and being blown away with what looked like a photo quality rendering, something that you would absolutely never see on the Genesis by itself. It's not perfect visually, there's no huge sprites or crazy special effects, and there is some slowdown when you're on a screen that's trying to animate Kyle and several enemies, but this is not a common occurrence and something that you won't see until you get to the last quarter of the game or so. The sound, like the graphics, is impressive as well. I certainly wouldn't say it's on the same level, and it shouldn't be, as one of the main drawbacks to the 32X was that it still relied on the aged FM-based sound hardware that the Genesis used. Having said that though, the background music is of good quality, using some nice clean synths and good instrumentation, with each area having its own music that represents the theme of that area well. For instance, the desert area has a very Arabian theme to it, without being too over the top, and still matching the nature of the game. If I had one complaint about the music, is that there's simply not enough of it. Now keep in mind, you'll frequently be in levels for at least 20 minutes, and that's if you're not having problems with a level and having to restart multiple times. Unless you turn off the music, you're going to end up hearing the same songs over and over, and as good as the music is, it would have been nice to have a bit more variety. The sound effects are as good as the music, crisp, clear, and sell the action well. There's plenty of gunfire and explosions as you might expect, and I like how each of the enemies has their own sounds, even, when they're making fun of you for taking a hit. Just like the music, it would have been nice had there been more, but I'm not sure where that would have come from, with Paradox even including things like enemies wrecking their rifles, and having Kyle's gun change in sound depending on which upgraded version of it that you're holding at the time. Blackthorne is the best 32X game that I've played thus far, and it's not even close. Granted, that's really not saying much as I haven't played that many 32X games for the channel up to this point, but I've got a feeling that by the time all is said and done, it will still be near the top. Unfortunately, the issues with the controls for the running jumps are a problem, and I've got to knock it a bit for that. It just really should be better, and it's not. I spent hours this week with the game hoping that eventually I'd figure out the timing, and it's just so specific that every time you have to hit one of those jumps, it's an absolute crapshoot, and when you have to hit multiple of ones of them in the row, you just forget about it. As a result, I'm giving Blackthorne 3 stars. If you happen to come across this one cheap and you're a 32X fan, I'd definitely recommend picking it up, but just be forewarned about the controls, as your controller might be taking flight.
And that's it for Blackthorne for the 32X. I mentioned the Blizzard Arcade collection earlier, and if you don't have copies of things like The Lost Vikings, Rock and Roll Racing, or Blackthorne, it's a must-own if you play on modern consoles. It retails for $20, goes on sale sometimes, and it's included in Game Pass if you're an Xbox gamer, so there's really no excuse not to pick it up. Plus, the original versions of the game support save states, which will possibly help with some of the frustration from the control issues that I discussed today. Who knows, maybe Blizzard will eventually see to revisiting some of these classic era IPs, but at least for now, we can still play them without having to dig out old hardware. Now, next time on the channel, I'm changing up the schedule a little bit in honor of Halloween. Previously, I had a baseball game on deck for next week, pun fully intended, and while that would be good with the upcoming World Series, I think it can wait for a few days. Instead, this is the game that really introduced me to the power of the Genesis. Sure, there's plenty of other fantastic early Genesis titles, things like Forgotten Worlds or Revenge of Shinobi, but this was the game that I played first, and despite its legendary difficulty, it was so good that I beat it honestly back in the day. And then, of course, immediately had to beat it again because that's how that game works. Gotta love the artificial length in arcade games. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 304. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!